What do you think is who do you think, just off the top of your mind briefly, we don't even have to dive into it, who do you think is the best shot of stopping Georgia?
I think Ohio State's roster is built to beat Georgia a couple times. Michigan's roster is there that Michigan's roster is built similarly to the two programs. Georgia and Michigan are kind of built similarly. Penn State, can we trust them to even beat Ole Miss in a bowl game?
No. Nope.
No, we can't. We can't even do that. So why would we expect them to beat Georgia? They're fine with the moderate teams. We can get into Penn State later if we want, but I don't really trust Penn State at all when it comes to this, or James Franklin, and more specifically. And Oregon, like we talked about earlier, is still, as a program, just behind Georgia. Case in point, in 2022, the 49-3 shellacking. So,
Yeah, but don't
by
don't you
process of,
think, like, looking at last season, Oregon was ranked ahead of Georgia in power rankings for much of the year. They they didn't play too different of schedules, at least before you factor in their bowl game and their championship game opponent. And Oregon was just dominant and whipping these teams left and right. Georgia really, in my mind, is almost inflated as a team based off of their Orange Bowl performance. Make no mistake about it, they were near elite or elite last year, but they didn't carry that same level of dominance. I mean, this is the team that trailed against South Carolina. They let Georgia Tech, and by let I don't mean like let Georgia Tech, oh, we just don't care about our rival, but Georgia Tech was actually in that game at multiple points. Mizzou was competing with them. Auburn was running up and down the field on them until the fourth quarter. I mean, objectively, even with their blowouts against Ole Miss and Kentucky, which I think is more due to how their offense and team is built rather than anything that's necessarily uber impressive, they were not as dominant as Michigan. And I don't think even in the regular season they controlled games as efficiently as Ohio State and Washington did, outside of maybe Washington's game against Arizona State and Ohio State's against Notre Dame. I only bring that up because Oregon last year, I think they were there, and it was just Dan Lanning growing as a coach, and Washington being physical, experienced, and having a elite coaching staff and an unstoppable passing offense, in truth, or close to an unstoppable passing offense that halted Oregon twice.
right. I still I think that Oregon's roster this year could beat Georgia's roster a couple times. If we're talking about beating a team out of 10 times, 3 to 5 times, I think they could beat Georgia. But I just think as a program and as a head coach in Dan Lanning, I think he still has some maturing to do when it comes to battling out with Nick Saban. Not Nick Saban. Kirby Smart. Excuse me. Kirby Smart is is the number one head coach in college football right now, and he has all the cards pretty much. When it comes to it, he knows all the tricks in the book. He coached under Nick Saban. Um, I still think Dan Lanning still has some learning to do, some maturing to do. I think he's almost there. He's had a couple seasons to get himself acclimated. He's going to have to get acclimated to the Big Ten, but I think they're the best out of the four recently Pac-12 teams coming into the Big Ten. I just think Ohio State, if you were to tell me, could they beat Georgia 6 times, possibly 7 times, 5 times, I think that I would be inclined to say Ohio State a little bit more. I think I trust Ryan Day's game management a little bit more than Dan Lanning, although they're kind of right there. But I would take Ryan Day over Dan Lanning for the moment when it comes to play calling. and just managing your team on the field.
I agree
That's
with
just
that.
my opinion.
So,
So
who do you think, because we've kind of, well, dragged our way here, or, who was the best shot at beating Georgia? Out of the big four teams, the far and away favorites to win the Big Ten, Ohio State, Oregon, Michigan, Penn State, how would you rank them in order of beating Georgia?
at number 4, yes, you guessed it, Penn State. No one trusts James Franklin to even beat Ole Miss or Michigan or Ohio State, much less Bama. So yeah, they're not going. They would probably beat Georgia once, getting lucky, in my opinion. Not to be harsh on Penn State, but that's just who they are right now with James Franklin. They have a good team. It's just they have that stigma. Anyway, number 3, I would probably rank. It would be close between Michigan and Oregon, but I think Michigan here, just because of the uncertainty that we have, maybe in year 2 of Sharon Moore next year, when we know who Alex Orji is, when they're a little bit more proven, they could be higher. But for now, because we still don't know quite where Alex Orji is going to stack up, especially against a team like Alabama. And sorry, why do I go back to Alabama today? Georgia, like a team like Georgia and their defense, especially how elite they are. How would Alex Orji acclimate to that? And then at 2, Oregon. At number 1, Ohio State. That's how I would rank them.
Interesting, because I actually have I'd say, hefty amount of disagreement outside of Penn State at 4. Look, Penn State, it really comes down to head coaching with James Franklin. That's really where it goes to. This team this year is underrated by practically everyone except for ESPN's FPI, which makes me question whether they're underrated or not, because FPI is insane, like on all kinds of drugs, typically. But they get a few things right, and I think they're right on Penn State being one of college football's best teams. The problem is, even when James Franklin had one of college football's best teams in 2017, he lost to an Ohio State team that he should have beaten by a touchdown or multiple touchdowns. He found a way to choke to them. And against Michigan State that season, another choke loss. And every single year since 2016, when they won the Big Ten championship game, they have blown leads, or they have been competitive in games up until the fourth quarter when things fall apart. And it's not necessarily a choke job when it happens here and there, because you're not always going to pull away and win in the fourth quarter. But when your record is worse than 1 out of like every 5 big games you win, when you're winning less than 20% of your top 10 matchups, that's a red flag, a big red flag. That is a building on fire in the distance telling you, do not come here. And they have questions with Drew Aller. They have questions at the offensive line. They have questions at wide receiver, defensive back, even parts of the defensive line, despite the fact that I think that Danny Dennis Sutton and Abdul Carter are going to be amazing as a defensive end duo, and they return all 4 of their 2 deep defensive tackles, including Hakeem Biaman, Keziah Izzard, and some other 2 players whose names I forget. But Julian Fleming's not a guarantee at receiver. They lost Lambert Smith to the portal. I love Tyler Warren, along with Nick Singleton, Katron Allen, Cooper Cousins look good in the spring game. But you look at Georgia, and I would just say nope. Michigan,
Yeah.
I have at 3rd, which might puzzle some people, and I actually have them at a distant 3rd. I think Ohio State and Oregon are in their own category when it comes to matching up against Georgia. For Michigan, and I want you guys to pause and think about this and not be reactive. If J.J. McCarthy, all else constant, everyone else leaves, Jim Harbaugh leaves. Everything else at Michigan happens the exact same, except McCarthy comes back. They would probably be number 1 or number 2 on this list. In fact, they'd probably be number 2 or number 3 by a significant margin in my national rankings, power rankings, and just ranking teams based off of the achievements I think that they would earn. Michigan is still loaded in the trenches. They're still loaded on defense. They have 2 projected first-round defensive tackles in Kenneth Grant and Mason Graham coming back. They return Will Johnson, first-rounder. They have 3 first-rounders on defense. Josiah Stewart and Derek Moore will be drafted by the NFL. And Amir Hall, incoming transfer, he's great. He'll likely start at corner. And they have players such as Jaden McBurrows, Makari Page, and Quentin Johnson, Zeke Berry, and Brandon Hillman, and others in that secondary who are ready to either step up or continue to make hefty contributions. And Ernest Hausman, he's a future NFL player. Same with Jayshon Barham. Their defense could be the best in the country. The offensive line, I don't think, has a likelihood of being the best in the country, but given how Sharon Moore's developed that unit, the fact that they return Miles Hinton and that Greg Crippen, Giovanni El-Hadi are junior, senior level players in terms of age, this is going to act more like a veteran group than some people think. But even with all of that being true and potentially giving more benefit of the doubt, let's say Michigan has the best defense in the country and an elite offensive line. The questions at quarterback and receiver are so deep and concerning that Michigan will likely have a one-dimensional offense. Donovan Edwards plus an elite offensive line is going to be scary, along with an elite defense. It might beat Ohio State again. It might beat Oregon. It could certainly beat Texas, given some of the concerns they have on defense. But a one-dimensional offense against Georgia is not a recipe for success. I don't think they could beat Georgia more than 4 times out of 10, and I would trend closer to 1 time out of 10 rather than 4. And then Ohio State and Oregon, it really is simple. They're close to Georgia in terms of talent. Ohio State has the elite defense of Michigan. It's built differently. Michigan, I think, is much better up front than Ohio State. And by much better, I don't mean in the sense that Ohio State's bad. In fact, Ohio State's elite to near elite in that range up front. Michigan's definitely elite up front. And the proven, more consistent level of play they have up there is why I say it's by a pretty sizable margin that Michigan is a better front. But it's the same with Ohio State's secondary over Michigan's. Ohio State is way deeper at Michigan compared to Michigan at secondary. And again, that's not saying Michigan's secondary is bad. It's a near elite to elite secondary. But Michigan's D-line and Ohio State's secondary are both the best in the country at those respective positions, in my opinion. But Ohio State has Will Howard, who's a top 25, top 20, maybe he could even be top 15 with a better supporting cast at quarterback. They have an elite wide receiver room, an elite running back room. While I don't think their O-line is as good as Michigan's, they're more balanced because they have the elite running backs. They're great to elite at every skill position, whether it's in depth, whether it's in average level of play. And Ryan Day, we can trust as a head coach. We know who Ryan Day is. And even though there are some questions surrounding his program, he's 56-8, 39-3 in Big Ten Conference play. And for Oregon, they're up there with Michigan in terms of trench play, but then they borrow the best of Ohio State's world with how awesome their skill position talent is. Their biggest question is the defense. Their defense last year was top 10, and looking at College Football Nerd's website in terms of, I want to say, expected performance or relative performance, they were top 10 as well. But they didn't face too tough of a schedule, and Washington manhandled them twice. So I just have Oregon at 1 because I think they're better in the trenches than Ohio State, and I think against a team like Georgia, trench play especially is important. Same with Oregon having a better QB. But I can see Ohio State being number 1 if their O-line is better than I expect it to be.
Yeah, that makes sense. I I largely agree with what you said. I think Michigan would stack up a little bit better just because of the fact that they've been there and done that, and a lot of their coaching staff, namely with Sharon Moore, they've been there and done that as well. So I think that they have the coaching experience and the player development to be there with Georgia. Nevertheless, I can only see them winning 3, 4 games against Georgia out of 10.
That's a good point that I didn't initially think of, is the fact that Michigan has been there. They've won the national title. They've won playoff games. Penn State, Oregon, they have not done that under their current regime. Ohio State did in 2020, but barely any of their current players even played for that team in 2020. If some Ohio State players were on the team in 2020, they were either they were extremely young, of course, and if they were playing college football during the COVID season, they were most likely at other schools if they had major playing time, or they were just amazing. Well, even if they were amazing at Ohio State, then they wouldn't have redshirted unless they were injured, so they'd probably be gone by now anyway. So for Ohio State, winning a playoff game might actually, that might cause almost an emotional letdown the following playoff game. I don't exactly know. I think Ryan Day is almost too good of a head coach to let that happen. But who knows? I think that's a really good point by you, is that Michigan's staff and players understand what it takes, and they've done it before. None of these other teams have, at least in the past 3 seasons, and for some even much longer.